Welcome back to the Deep Dive, where we take your curiosity and some seriously fascinating source material and dive deep, uncovering insights you won't find anywhere else.
That's right.
Today, we're stepping into the high-stakes world of India's Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code.
The IBC.
Exactly, the IBC, with a focus on the new guidelines for the Committee of Creditors released just last month on August 6th. You sent over a collection of articles and analyses to get the full picture, and I have to say,
A lot.
it is. It's some juicy stuff. We're talking about a potential game changer in how India handles struggling companies. So before we dive into the nitty-gritty, let's make sure we're all on the same page. You know I like to start with the basics. In the world of the IBC, the Committee of Creditors, or COSERA, is kind of a big deal.
It really is the heart of the IBC's creditor and control model.
Exactly. It's like this powerful board often made up of financial creditors who essentially step in when a company is on shaky ground.
Right.
And here's where it gets really interesting. The CUCWEC's power goes beyond just recovering money.
Oh, absolutely.
They have the authority to decide the fate of a company. They could revive it, restructure it, or even decide it's time to call it a day and liquidate.
Big responsibility.
Let's talk about pressure.
It is a huge responsibility, and that's why these new guidelines are so important. They're designed to provide a framework for COSECs, promoting transparency, ethical conduct, and a more holistic approach to resolving insolvency.
You brought up a good point when you sent in your request for this deep dive. You were particularly curious about this whole idea of balancing the COSEC's commercial wisdom with ensuring fairness for everyone involved. It's
Yeah.
not just about the big lenders, right?
Absolutely. The IBC was designed to be a complete overhaul of the old system, but like any major reform, it's an ongoing process. These guidelines signal that India is serious about fine-tuning this process, ensuring it works as intended.
It's fascinating to see a system in evolution, constantly adapting and refining itself, and you've given us the perfect lens to view it through with these sources. Now, these guidelines aren't just some dry bureaucratic document. They dig into some seriously important considerations for Couples 9 to be exact. We're talking to everything from avoiding conflicts of interest, which you might expect, to some more nuanced ideas like proactively sharing information and even keeping the costs of the insolvency process in check.
It's about recognizing that insolvency resolution isn't just a legal process. It has real-world consequences for everyone involved. Employees, suppliers, the overall economy.
Right. So you're not just dealing with balance sheets and legal jargon, you're dealing with people's livelihoods. And that adds a whole other layer of complexity to the equation. And that takes us right into the heart of these guidelines, these 9 key areas that consies need to be mindful of. Let's unpack them one by one, let's start with something called professional competence and participation, a concept you highlighted in your notes. It really resonated with you, this idea that the people making these weighty decisions should actually know what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. It's crucial. You want people who are well-versed in the IBC, all its nuances.
Right.
And they need to be appointing representatives who are equally capable, people who can actively participate, make informed decisions, and do it all efficiently.
So it's not just about showing up, it's about showing up ready to, really engage.
Absolutely. Understand the complexities.
Yeah.
Contribute to a resolution that makes sense.
Right.
And, that ties into another key consideration, objectivity and integrity. This is a big one. The guidelines are very clear that decisions need to be impartial and firmly rooted in the principles of the IBC.
No personal agendas then.
No, not at all. And to reinforce that, there's a strong emphasis on independence and impartiality. If a COAGA member has any personal or business ties that could even remotely be perceived as a conflict of interest, they have to disclose it.
Transparency is key.
100%. You got to make sure everything is above board from the get-go.
Right.
And it's not just about avoiding conflicts. It's about fostering a collaborative environment. And that's where cooperation, supervision, and timelines come in.
Okay, let's unpack that one a bit. What does that look like in practice?
Well, the COSE can't just sit back and delegate everything to the insolvency professional, right?
Right.
They need to be actively involved, overseeing the process, making sure it stays on track, and meeting those crucial deadlines.
So teamwork is essential.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's all about working together efficiently and effectively. Of course, amidst all this collaboration, you can't forget about confidentiality. We're dealing with sensitive financial matters, and the guidelines are very clear about protecting that information.
Right. You've got to strike that balance between transparency and discretion.
Exactly. Now, this next one might seem a bit specific, but it's really important. Costs. You actually flagged this one in your notes as well.
I did. It caught my eye, I have to admit. Why the focus on expenses?
Because insolvency resolution can be expensive. The guidelines are really urging these COSIs to be mindful of that. Be swift in your decisions about the insolvency professional's fees, ensure efficient liquidation processes are being used, and basically avoid any unnecessary delays that rack up costs.
Time is money, as they say.
Exactly. And speaking of time, let's move on to meetings of the COSI. I believe you specifically mentioned wanting to know more about this aspect. The guidelines dedicate an entire section to how these meetings should be conducted.
Oh, I'm all ears. Tell me more.
They stress that these meetings are not just a formality. They're an opportunity to scrutinize the insolvency professional's actions, understand the rationale, discuss any late claims that pop up. Basically active engagement, not passive observation.
So it's about staying organized, keeping that momentum going, and making sure those meetings are productive.
Yeah, absolutely. And this ties into something you highlighted in one of the articles you share, which I found really interesting.
Okay.
And it's just directly in the guidelines. This whole idea of sharing of information.
Ah, yes. That's a good one. That article really emphasized how important it is for everyone to be on the same page for this whole system to work.
Exactly. And that's what the guidelines are pushing for. They're really urging COSIs to be proactive about sharing relevant financial statements, audit extracts, basically anything that could give that insolvency professional a clearer picture of the situation.
Like, don't hold back, folks. Let's get all the cards on the table.
Exactly. And it goes even further. They're encouraging COSIs to inquire about any ongoing litigation involving the company and even brainstorm ways to protect the company's interests during the insolvency process. It's a very engaged, collaborative approach.
It really is. It seems like a huge shift from that old adversarial mindset to one that prioritizes solutions.
Absolutely. And that takes us to the final and perhaps most crucial consideration, the feasibility and viability of the corporate debtor.
This is where the rubber meets the road, right? This isn't just about cutting losses. It's about figuring out if this company has any chance of survival.
Exactly. And the guidelines are clear on this. COSIs need to really dive deep into that information memorandum, offer insights, and even contribute to developing marketing strategies for the company's assets.
So it's not just about liquidation anymore.
Not at all. The emphasis is shifting. It's moving towards rehabilitation, giving those viable companies a chance to restructure, recover, and get back on their feet.
To contribute back to the economy.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier that the IBC was designed to be a complete overhaul of how things used to be.
It was.
This really does feel like a massive departure from the old ways.
It really is. And you had mentioned an interest in seeing how this stacks up against other countries. We often get so focused on our own systems that we forget to look at what's happening elsewhere.
Right. It's like trying to solve a puzzle without looking at the bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you asked us to compare India's system to those of Singapore, the UK, and the US. And I think that's a really great point of comparison.
I'm always interested in those global comparisons, yeah.
Yeah. And what's fascinating is that while each of those countries has its own unique approach, there are some really striking similarities.
Interesting.
Particularly when it comes to the core principles.
Okay.
The UK, for example, has its Statement of Insolvency Practice 15, which, much like India's new guidelines, stresses things like transparency, accountability, and fairness.
So even with different systems, the values are aligned.
Absolutely. And we see those same themes echoed in the U.S. Bankruptcy Code as well. But what's interesting about the U.S. system is its really strong emphasis on giving debtors a fighting chance, primarily through what they call Chapter 11 bankruptcy.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That allows companies to restructure their debts and operations under court protection, right?
Exactly. And it includes what's known as an automatic stay, which basically halts creditor actions, gives the debtor a little breathing room to sort things out.
It's like a timeout while everyone takes a breath.
Yeah.
And tries to figure things out.
A very apt analogy.
Yeah.
Now, Singapore's system is interesting because they rely on a more centralized approach.
Okay.
They have a judicial management process, which is similar to India's CIRP in that it aims to rehabilitate the company.
Hold on, CIOP. For our listeners, can you clarify what that is?
Oh, yes, of course. That's the corporate insolvency resolution process under the IBC. Sorry about that.
No worries.
But going back to Singapore, the key difference is that their process is overseen by the courts. They have this figure, the judicial manager, who basically acts as a combination of India's resolution professional and the COSI.
Interesting. A hybrid approach.
Exactly. It just highlights how different countries have found ways to balance those competing interests and achieve, hopefully, the best outcome
Right.
for everyone involved.
This has been an incredible deep dive. We really explored those new guidelines for COCIEDs, unpacked all those key considerations.
A lot to think about.
There is. And we even got to do a little global comparison, which is always fun.
Always interesting to see how other countries approach the same issues.
It is. But if there's one thing I hope you take away from all of this, it's that insolvency resolution is changing. It's no longer just about, winners and losers.
It's about finding a path forward.
Exactly. And I, for one, am really curious to see how these guidelines shape the future of insolvency resolution in India. I have a feeling this story is far from over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep those minds curious, and we'll see you on the next one.